Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Get Jasched. I am your host, Jess Jasch. Thank you for joining me. Before we get into today's conversation, I wanted to remind you of a couple of things that you may like to partake in some way. One is my first book, my brand new book, Leaders Who Thrive, A Mindful Antidote for Disconnected Teams, is coming out in September and it is available for adding to your wish list at this point. The pre-order will open soon. But you can add it to your wish list. I'll include the link in the show notes in the caption below, so that way you can just follow that and choose your preferred online retailer. It will also be available in select bookstores, but I can't confirm what they are yet. So you can find it directly on Routledge through Booktopia and on Amazon. So that's the book. It's coming out. It's very exciting. And you can also join the Get Jasched Meditation Plus subscription library, which is attached to this podcast, but it is a $7 US dollar per month subscription, and you get weekly guided meditation practices of all different kinds suited for people who are typically very cerebral and in their heads, and you also get access to the existing library, so whatever has been released so far. I think this week is episode 23 or 24, so you'll get access to that, and then every week you'll get a new practice as well. I'll include the link below there for you too. But let's get into the conversation, because today we're talking about workplace culture, and I think it's a really important conversation to have, and we're just going to talk about it very openly and honestly, as we usually do, because it's one of those things where sometimes many businesses, and I get why, right? I get that sometimes you think that's what you need to do, or that's all that's required, or something like that. But many businesses will kind of just talk about it and think that that is what's going to follow through. So they might talk about how, they're people first, or they value well-being, or we're like family, which has another whole host of red flags along with that anyway. But they will often sort of defer to whatever the words are that found their way onto the website or onto the wall of the office of the wherever you conduct work, or onto the email signature graphics, or whatever it is, right? So often that can be, sure, a really good way of conveying what is important to you as a culture, as a business, yes. But often when you actually speak to someone that works there, you tend to find out a little bit more, and often, or sometimes, I keep saying often, but sometimes their experience of working there actually tells a bit of a different story. So, it's this issue of when companies, businesses, organizations, all sorts rely on their value statement, but they don't follow through with looking at what is the experience every single day in every single decision. And it's not about being perfect either, but really looking at what is the experience people are actually having on a daily basis, and how can we really look at that. So culture is actually the experience, not so much what is being said about it. So, it can be intentional in this way. You could be ticking boxes and going, well, we'll just do whatever we want, and still just say that we're about this. And it can be unintentional, obviously, as well. And that can be something that is very innocent, but sometimes it's about not having had the resources or the right guidance, or the thing that can help you really look at the two pieces, because sometimes very naturally you'll get caught up in just doing the work. But it's important to consider that this is also part of the work of running a business, of being in leadership, all of that. It's not just the output that you have for your clients in this case, whether it's a product or a service or in anything, but it is really important to look at what is the culture. And by that, I mean by experience, like the experience of every day, you could look at things like who is getting rewarded and why, because that can be really telling and informing. What or who gets ignored and why. So it could be behavior, it could be practices, whether they are practices that follow through on processes or practices that skip processes and still gets ignored or rewarded, who gets promoted and why. This is a big one, and obviously like the bigger corporations you get into, sometimes the easier this can be to spot in a way, but not exclusively. So, you know, looking at who gets promoted can be based on who's really earned it, or have there been the proper job advertising practices involved here, or, you know, is it straight up nepotism or someone that knows someone because they golf with them kind of approach, right? And that does still happen. So things like that. You can also look at how are mistakes handled and addressed, and that comes down to you know, is someone super reprimanded for mistakes, or are they encouraged to learn better? What kind of mistake is it? And is that person in this scenario, do they get away with something that other people wouldn't? You know, so it sort of goes both directions as well. And all of that comes down to, do people actually feel psychologically safe? So here in Australia, throughout the different states, there are different psychological safety laws and legislation that have come in recently, over the last year or so, you know, and staggered. But there's legislation, but then there's also still the experience of. So do people feel psychologically safe, and are you actually, you as a leader, whether you own the business or not, are you as a leader actually trying to create that sense of safety and security? And I say security because it is really important to remember that discomfort doesn't mean unsafe either. So sometimes you have to have uncomfortable conversations, and that is for the betterment of everyone, the entire organization, as well as everyone within the organization. So discomfort doesn't equal unsafe, but it is really important to consider how are you approaching these things? How are you allowing these things? And then my favorite thing is, how do leaders communicate or respond when they're under pressure? That's kind of why I'm in the work that I'm in. That's kind of been my whole crux of my entire work, my entire business has been, how do you respond when you're under pressure? And could you be doing that a little bit better? So these are things that you want to consider if you're going to really, really look at how is our actual culture being experienced. And, you know, you can do all of the anonymous surveys or non-anonymous surveys you like. But sometimes you actually have to lead the question, because if you're asking for feedback, whether it is anonymous or not, if you're asking for general feedback, like, oh, give some feedback about your leader or your experience, blah, 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 that doesn't actually direct the person to share. Just because you say it's not going to be punished or anything like that, sometimes it still does make it harder for someone to answer honestly about their experience. So you have to lead the questions. So I'm not saying surveys are the only way, but just in the sense of, you can find out by asking people their experience, but you need to lead the question of, what is your experience of this? Do you feel like you get rewarded appropriately, or people get rewarded appropriately for doing right things? What behavior do you feel like is ignored? You know, you can lead using those questions, but you need to also consider what that is yourself, but be willing to hear the experience of other people and be willing to receive that. And that can be challenging too, because we all like to think we're doing a good job, or we don't like to rock the boat where we don't need to because life is easier that way, right? But if you actually want to make an improvement, this is how you can start to look at that. This is how you can actually really get some information that can then determine what do you do with it from there. There's a lot happening in the economy and in all of these areas that does impact how people feel too. So, you know, some of the challenges that can come up are really around when restructures happen, especially when the budget tightens, or if even if it's not a restructure, if changes happen because of the budget changing, because of economic pressures, which are very valid, very real, that can create some waves within the culture, let's say. So people notice that if they feel like they're not getting the same level of support, if they feel like they're being managed out or replaced, there's all of these scenarios that come into budgets tightening, deadlines being missed, and all of these can kind of go into each other as well. But deadlines being missed, whether it's because of stress and overwhelm or staff turnover, where those people haven't been replaced, so that workload has gone on to the people remaining, and it's just too much work for the amount of staff you have, or anything like that. It's really important to really notice not just deadlines being missed, but finding out why, what is actually happening, and again, asking the questions so that you can get more informed answers that then give you actual information. So that is a really important one. Conflict can appear. Why is there conflict? It's not always people being contrarian. Sometimes it is. Sometimes that's important to acknowledge too. Is someone just being contrarian because they enjoy it, because they want to, or is there usefulness to it? Does conflict appear because people haven't communicated clearly enough? How do you hold space for people to ask questions for clarification without seeing it as conflict, without seeing it as challenge? Because, as a neurodivergent individual, sometimes, like, I know the feeling of really needing to understand something and wanting to understand the why, not to be difficult, but because it helps me learn, for starters, but it also helps me follow through and make sure I'm really not missing anything. And I know a lot of people who have that feeling and need an experience when they ask questions that is seen as being difficult. So really diving into the deeper levels and layers and understanding of why is the conflict there, and where is it coming from? Is it actually conflict? So that's something to be really aware of too. That can also do with burnout. So if people are burning out, why? Sometimes people are just stressed outside of work and there's limited things that you can do, but it's not all of that. What can you do to support people, but to prevent burnout? Burnout is, once it's there, on a personal level as well as on a business and team level, once it's there, it's a really hard thing to actually walk back from. It takes a lot of extra time and effort. So what you really want to be doing is preventing burnout proactively, doing a lot of these things proactively instead of just pushing through and hoping and wishing for the best, and then all of a sudden, then dealing with the burnout, because it will inevitably happen. And then really consider, in relation to burnout, but not exclusively, because burnout can happen across anyone, what happens when the leaders are stressed? Why are they stressed? Have they been given a role without being given authority to follow through on it properly, but with still the expectation? But are they being given adequate training and tools to manage their own stress, not just so they feel better and everyone else can feel like shit, but so that they can actually lead better and make clearer decisions and contribute to the culture? Everyone contributes to culture. Everyone contributes to culture. And leaders have the most influence over culture because they have the most decision-making authority. It's the power imbalance. So you really need to consider how leaders are showing up in a way that impacts culture, because it is good to care. Generally speaking, it is good to genuinely care. It is good to be approachable. It is useful and good to believe that, yes, well-being does matter. These things do matter, but you need to look at behavior, and this is where it comes down to leaders first and foremost, not only, not solely, but predominantly and definitely first. How are leaders contributing to the culture by how they are doing things, how they are behaving, and how their team is experiencing them? Because you can have the best intentions in the world, and yet it doesn't really mean shit if someone's experience is still alternate to that intention. It can mean a little bit, but nothing really significant in regards to culture, because there will become a point where people will tire of going, well, he means well, she means well, they mean well. They're, they're under the pump too. If their experience, if their quality of their own well-being is being negatively impacted by that leadership for long enough, regardless of how much that leader cares. And this is the blessing and the burden of leadership. Yes, it is asking for you to do more, but that is also the role of leadership. That is the role of leadership. It's asking a lot of you, but it's also your job too. It's a skill, and you don't have to step into that role already having that skill. It's kind of a lifelong skill, but you do need to actually prioritize it. That makes the biggest difference. So instead of just focusing on, well, what do we stand for? What are our words? What are our values? What are the words that we would put on the wall? How would we summarize it? Start to ask those questions of yourself first, and then ask for feedback of people's experience. But then when you do that, again, it is up to you to make sure that you are able to receive that feedback without negative consequences to anyone just because they've shared. Without argument, you just have to go, all right, that's information. Whether it's reasonable or not, that is information. So you ask the questions, things like, what behaviors do we actually reward? And really look at it, not just what reward systems and incentive systems do we have set up, but look at actually like, well, unconsciously, we also tend to reward this kind of behavior, or we tolerate this kind of behavior, or we hold the belief that people need to do or believe a certain thing in order to succeed, or asking, what do people believe that they need in order to succeed here? Because if people's experiences are, well, I need to be a total douchebag and just really selfish in order to succeed, that may be contrary to your actual values, but if that's what they are experiencing because that's what gets rewarded, that's going to be important information for you to know. What conversations are people afraid to have? What conversations are we as leaders afraid to have? Also important, extra important. What conversations are other people afraid to have with us or with each other, and why? Without punishment in finding that answer, just understanding. And what conversations are we afraid to have, and why? And beyond the initial onboarding of new people, you could really look at it like, what would a new employee learn about our organization that isn't necessarily written anywhere? In their first month or so, what would they actually learn? And if your answer is, well, that depends on who onboards them or who trains them, that's important information. If your answer goes into more detail of like, well, they'd probably learn, and you need to look at the actual, not at what decisions have been consciously made about how the business operates and what gets rewarded and all of that, but you need to look at the actual behavior, the actual experience. So it's more of the unconscious things. What's unconsciously rewarded? How are we treating each of these people? If that person's a dick but they make heaps of sales, and so we keep them on, but they're making everyone else's lives a little bit more miserable, even just little by little, we are rewarding that. So you really need to get real and honest with yourself when you do this. Which is why it is helpful to have someone else who is not a part of the organization step you through it and take you through it, and sometimes even data collect that information for you, because it makes it a little bit clearer and it makes it a little bit less of a personal process, but it also helps someone really objective from being in it, because you can sometimes not see the forest for the trees. And that's why I do what I do as well with clients, because it can be really hard when you are in it, understandably, because we're human, you're busy, but you are also in it every day. And when you're in it every day, it becomes harder to see some of the other things. So that's just a bit of context of why it can be useful to have someone else from outside come in and take you through this process and support you, because you need to be able to see things with fresh eyes. And if you feel like it's too hard to try to do that yourself, or you don't really know where to start, you want to make sure that you are doing this. So however you do it, with support or independently, is the most important. The fact that you are doing it, because this is how culture is built. Culture is built in the actual everyday experience. I think strategy and planning days are so useful in being intentional and setting up those intentions. But again, this is also why I help clients do this too. But this is why it's important to dive into, well, what are the steps we're going to take here? And what are we going to do? How are we going to pick up on what isn't working, or what is going in the opposite direction of what we say we value? And what are we going to do about it when we do pick up on it? How are we going to pick up on it? And then what are we going to do about it? And that's important if you really want to actually change or improve your culture. If you really want to understand what your culture, the experience of your culture is, you have to be willing to look at the warts of it, to regardless of your intentions. And that can be hard. That's normal too, especially if your intentions are so genuine and it still might be missing the mark. And that's okay, because there's always going to be a solution, but you need to understand where it's at in order to find the solution. So really consider that in terms of how you approach and how you consider culture. This is a start, but you have to take it beyond just listening to this as well. But if you think that there is another leader who might find this start useful, please share this with them. If you are interested in looking at what that support could look like, because it feels like too much for your workload, or you just want that more objective, neutral view from outside to help you navigate it, to gather the information, whatever it is, this is what I do and support clients with. So please reach out, and we can have a conversation and explore what that looks like depending on your circumstance as well, and your business. And really consider making sure that your culture is something that is experienced, not just things you say over and over again hoping that it will land. That's really the crux of it. So thank you for joining me. I will see you again next time.